We've been doing this podcast for 2.5 years now, and the most listened to episodes are always the ones talking about career and certifications in Treasury. So we decided to partner up with the AFP, the Association for Financial Professionals, so we can offer you a $100 discount code on all of the AFP's products. This includes, of course, the CTP, the Certified Treasury Professional, which is hands down the most renowned and recognized certification in Treasury out there. And of course, the access to the CTP exam prep platform as well. Check the link in the description to access to those discount codes and take your career to the next level.
Harald, welcome to the Corporate Treasury 101 podcast. Really great to have you on. We'd like to start broad with your expertise in Deloitte specifically and where mergers and acquisitions fits into Treasury. So starting a little bit broad first, what is M&A and how does it impact companies?
Well, thanks you guys for having me. Really pleasure to discuss that quite exciting topic on M&A and Treasury. So, what is M&A? M&A is a broad term. Of course, you're all aware it's mergers and acquisitions, nothing too fancy. But of course, in the Treasury landscape, it really depends on which side of the table you're sitting. Yeah. So typically what we're looking at is the acquisition from a buyer perspective. So you're taking over a company, you're typically integrating Treasury, but also from a seller perspective. Yeah. So either you're taken over or parts are taken over. And the third one, which is quite important and has become quite often used in the last years, like carve-outs or spin-offs. So in terms of redefining the overall company strategy, you think about selling part of the business. You build a small group, and you typically do a carve-out, sell that. You need to build up a new treasury, so quite an important area. And every now and then we see mergers, typically, the big ones in the past, mergers of equals, where of course then it's typically not 100% equal, but then you need to see how you kind of set up your treasury going forward. So that's all the aspects we would see under M&A generally.
Typical. So you've got the acquirer company, the acquirer, spin-off, mergers, all of those I'm sure bring their own unique treasury challenges, right? If you're being acquired as a treasurer, you're like, okay, how does that impact me? If I'm acquiring another company, how does that impact my treasury? If I'm merging, that must be very different. What happens to the treasury department when the company goes through a merger or acquisition?
Well, as you correctly said, it really depends on the scenario you're in. I think in common are really the dimension that you need to tackle. No matter if you're divesting, if you're acquiring, it's always kind of a handful of dimensions. So typically it's around strategy and organization. So does the strategy still fit? If you buy new business, new company, new business model, you might need to change your strategy of treasury. Is your organization still fitting? Not just from a size perspective, but also from a geographical fit perspective, for example. You typically need to adjust your governance structure, guidelines, policies, and so on. Then it comes to people and talent, becomes more and more important. Retaining talent, keeping the good people, but still then having an efficient team. It's all about process setup and keeping processes stable around cash, risk, liquidity, basically across the board. Technology is typically a big thing, and I think we're going to talk about that later. If you do an acquisition, it's typically two systems. That's not too efficient going forward, of course. So it's always to be thought about what's the way ahead. And lastly, not the most fun part to do, but typically it's a lot of contractual aspects that need to be taken care of. It's new internal contracts, new banking contracts. You have change of control clauses in financing and the like. So quite a bit of stuff along those dimensions that need to be tackled, no matter, let's say, which M&A scenario you're in.
So there seem to be quite some impacts, obviously. What are the typical risks that treasury departments face when a merger or acquisition or carve out or spin off happens?
Well, I mean, I think risks are twofold. One is typically there's limited time, there's limited resources, and there's a lot of work. So I mean,
Sounds familiar.
yeah, classic, and in projects, but in M&A, I mean, typically because I mean, M&A timelines are defined by the M&A, the board, and you kind of need to adhere to that. So that is typically the biggest challenge, and therefore also risk. Treasury is kind of responsible for payment readiness, that the group has sufficient funding and financing, that you can do your hedging. And I mean, having all that at risk, I think are the key risks to be really payment and financing readiness. As of day one, I would determine as the core risk.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. So what are the typical adjustments that treasury departments need to make because of those risks, but because of overall what's happening? I think the timeline is something you mentioned that is pretty important, especially when it comes to system implementations, rethinking of the structure and so on. So what are the adjustments that treasury needs to make in these circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, it depends a bit on the scenario we're looking at. But I mean, one of the biggest, typically organization and people. Yeah, so typically you either split off your team or you acquire a team. So the question of how to set up your organization, your processes, your people, your regional treasury centers, where you have one in Singapore, you acquire one in Bangkok. You need to think about the whole, let's say, target operating model around people. I would say that's key, especially to retain the right talent. As I said earlier, not to lose the key people along the road. Secondly, it's technology, I would say, really, and using, well, that change as a chance, right, for a bigger transformation to optimize processes, organization, and so on. And typically, technology plays a big role in that environment. And last, change-wise, is financing/banking. So typically, M&A comes with quite some change in financing. You either need new financing in a carve-out, you need to replace financing in an acquisition, you need to internalize certain financing from the external side, and you typically have 100 banks already and you acquire another 100, which is again not ideal. So it's quite a lot of work typically to harmonize the bank landscape there as well.
Quick question on that financing aspect. This is, as you said, there is lots and lots of contractual considerations, right? But typically the funding part is not only anchored for 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the case of a revolving credit facility, for instance, but you're also drawing into it. So we're going to get into much more details further down this episode, but I'm curious to understand how it works when both companies, the acquiring one and the acquired one, both have funding maybe for overlapping functions. How does it typically go there?
Well, it's typically indeed the case that the acquiring company in the first place takes over the debt of the to be acquired company, but then to the extent contractually possible, refinances that. So basically gets rid of the debt to the extent possible. Now, of course, in the bond market, that's not always possible. You need to have call options or convertible options or what have you. In some bilateral bank contracts, you have change of control clauses which allow you to terminate. That is quite a big thing. Also on the legal lawyer side, we looked into how that can be optimized quite fast going forward. Especially as the acquiring company typically has already established like the big acquisition financing, including a bridge loan and all those facilities in place. So it's of course one very important thing is on financing and funding.
In all of those risk factors, Harald, I mean, when you come in as Deloitte and you come into, you're consulted on, hey, look, we're, let's say, acquiring this company in the US, small company, whatnot. What is the one make or break factor that you're like, okay, this is the one thing that we need to make sure we get right? And I've seen it again and again. If we get this one thing wrong, the Treasury Department is just done for. So you're in a crisis mode. What's the one
I mean, the one is being able to pay, and with that come, of course, three dimensions. I mean, if a corporate
Pay for the company, or pay your staff ongoing, like pay the new staff, or like actually fund the deal.
No, it's actually, I mean, typically funding the deal, I mean, is negotiated by the big M&A banks, and you typically have your funding in place. Otherwise, the contract is typically not
They
signed.
wouldn't have gone forward. Okay.
It's paying your suppliers, it's paying your employees, it's paying your rent, which sounds simple and easy. But if you think about now, for example, in the carve-out scenario where you need to establish new bank accounts, bank relations across the world, globally, with 50 different payment formats, 20 different ERP systems, no time, limited knowledge, then being able to do a mass payment becomes difficult. Yeah. And linked to that, of course, you need to have adequate funding in place. Also, I mean, typically, centrally, not a problem, but you have a lot of regulated countries that need to pay salaries and suppliers. So they need to have local credit lines, local funding that needs to be set up, for example, in a carve-out scenario where you have a newly established entity. So I would say everything on the, being able to pay related to funding is the one thing. If that is not working, then basically the whole, I mean, technically speaking, if you're not, you're running into bankruptcy. So that is quite an issue to be tackled. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, maybe I should be more specific with my question, but because you took it down an interesting route yourself. I mean, the spin-offs, for example, it just means, okay, not only are you have to set up a completely legal entity and then separate bank accounts, separate revenue streams, separate everything out and parse everything out that maybe before was a bit more blurry and mixed.
No, exactly. I mean, that's exactly the case. So in that carve-out scenario, you establish a new entity, you need to do the full KYC, bank account, payment, readiness, connectivity. So that's of course huge. I mean, in terms of acquiring, I would indeed say it's the funding and then the orchestration of paying. So especially if you're talking, I don't know, 5, 6, 10, 20 billion, orchestrating that those funds are on the escrow accounts on the day that you need the money, get that all orchestrated is, of course, I mean, you're heavily supported by the banks related to that, but it's still quite some orchestration related to that required.
Interesting. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit into each scenario, Harald, if you don't mind, where we look at the treasurer's role in each of these M&A scenarios. So starting with company acquisitions. So as a treasurer, if my company is looking to acquire another, what are my main considerations I need to make as a treasurer and my main responsibilities?
I mean, that typically starts quite early in due diligence related activities. Yeah. So typically treasury is involved quite early in the due diligence process when the data room from the to be acquired companies are being opened in terms of cash flow situation, funding situation, guarantees and the like. So that's typically when treasury first plays a role. Once, let's say, the deal gets clearer, it's the whole thing on funding. Yeah, how can we fund the purchase price? Typically, it's not cash in the bank, right? So typically, it's quite a structure where you typically have a bridge loan, which is then replaced by longer-term funding, like bonds or the like on the funding side. And with that comes, of course, risk management-related aspects. In many situations, purchase prices are being paid in non-functional currency. Yeah, you take over an entity in the US, you have dollar, where dollar fluctuations might lead to an increase of the price by quite a lot of millions in euro equivalent. So hedging that is an issue where you typically then use FX deal contingent forward. So basically FX forward, which are linked to an event, like an acquisition. But also on the interest rate side, of course, especially looking at current interest rates, that was not that much of an issue maybe 7 or 5 years ago, but in recent years it has become more and more important, of course, having interest rate risk management and the strategies in place. And then it comes, as I said, on the coordination of the purchase price payment itself. But that is, of course, all prior to closing. So that's all preparational activities, if you like. Yeah, and then Afterwards, it's really typically the short-term replacement of the funding from the target, and then starting to get transparency on risks, on cash, on banks and the like. So typically having that transparency in place is very important, where quite some corporates work with or M&A advisors, as we are as a clean team approach, where you already have a team which is basically analyzing that information prior to closing already. And then you have indeed the whole integration process or project, basically on people, organization, processes, contracts and the like, but which is, depending on size and complexity, takes 6 months up to 3 years, really depending on speed and complexity. So quite a lot of aspects starting early, but typically also taking quite a while after closing until everything is really fully done.
An interesting one that you just mentioned. How does it, I guess it links to the treasury policy of the acquiring company, but do you typically determine FX hedging budget for acquisitions? Like, do you hedge 100% of the transaction, only part of it? What if the actual transfer takes more time? And that's typical in the M&A circumstances because of contractual issues and considerations and so on. So how does the hedge of such a big transaction, because we are often looking at, company's value, so that's pretty substantial. How does it work?
It is pretty substantial, indeed. And I mean, there's no golden 100% correct way. From what we've experienced is it's really kind of related to the probability that the deal will occur. Correlating to the probability, you increase your hedge ratio. So at an early stage, you typically don't start any hedging yet. You basically, once you have a first business plan calculation where then the result is a potential purchase price, and you have process and negotiations to a certain extent, they typically enter into hedging, especially on the FX side. But as said, typically on those deal contingent forwards, which of course basically imply that the rate you get is probably a tiny bit worse than if you wouldn't. But if the deal, for whatever reason it might be, is not happening, you're not obliged to fulfill the deal, but it basically ceases to exist.
Interesting. I didn't know that the deal contingent FX hedging forward, was existing. That's amazing. So you still pay a little fee, I guess, right? The bank, whatever the institution you're dealing with, won't do all that for free. It's a risk, it's an exposure, the other way around as well. So how does it work? You just pay a small fee and you're like, okay, the deal didn't go through, so sorry, but you still get a bit of money out because of this, or?
No, I mean, it's typically basically integrated into the fee quotation already, right? So
right.
That's what I meant with basically the small margin of risk quotation compared to the standard market.
Sorry, going a bit down the rabbit hole,
no
but I was super curious. Makes sense. So we already quickly touched upon our next point, which is around funding, liquidity, and risk management. You mentioned that you need to make sure the key success criteria, success factor is being able to pay everybody. You also mentioned how it works typically in the funding part, like typically the acquiring company would repay the debt of the acquired company. But just to make sure we don't overlook anything, like, is there anything else that treasurers should consider when they approach funding, liquidity, and risk management in the context of an acquisition? But maybe we can also break it down in, as you mentioned, acquisition, being acquired, merger, spin-off, carve-outs, all those scenarios.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of really being acquiring party, I think a lot we've already been discussing. I think once the acquisition has been completed, as I said earlier, it's a lot of transparency on cash forecasting, liquidity, sustainable cash flows in order to repay acquisition debt. That's key, and that's one of the, let's say, closing plus 100 days activities that definitely typically need to be established. Secondly, it's transparency on risk management to understand FX exposures, understand currency exposures, integrate that into your hedging policy. But as said, sometimes the existing hedging policy does not necessarily fit Yeah, so for example, you're currently doing 80% project business, yeah, but you acquire product business, which has a different risk horizon, different possibilities to adapt prices to currency rate fluctuations and the like. So you probably have a different hedging horizon, you have a different hedging ratio. So there's quite often the case that you need to adapt your hedging policy to be more differentiated in case you have basically acquired a bit of heterogeneous business on the go. Yeah. And at that on funding, I mean, the typical thing is that you try to internalize as much funding as possible, get rid of everything external. Of course, there's always the limitations on regulated countries, India, Brazil, China, you name it, where you need to have your local funding in place. But everything else typically is internalized and replaced then by internal funding.
So cash visibility, cash flow forecasting, making sure you have a proper view on everything, that makes me think of systems. And from a previous experience in treasury system integrations as well, I know how messy it can be just looking at one company, so let alone in a merger and acquisition scenario. So beyond just explaining how important it is, because I suspect it is very much important, how does it all work? The integration of treasury systems and operations in an acquisition scenario?
I mean, I would say typically in an acquisition scenario, it's even the easier case, if you can call that easy. It's still not easy. Some of my clients will probably call me crazy if I say that's easy, but I would say at least in terms of decision making, because of course you typically have the situation two companies, two systems, but it's typically not only two systems, but it's really two landscapes consisting out of various systems. But in the acquisition scenario, it's typically the case that a to be acquired company is integrated and at a certain point in time shuts down the old legacy system. Yeah, so that ceases to exist and they're basically integrated into the acquirer system. Just as a matter of time and priority, but typically that is approached quite fastly to be integrated. It of course gets more interesting if we're, let's say, having really huge acquisitions and or mergers, where we're more talking about 50-50, 45-55 in terms of company size and complexity, because then the question arises, well, is the right system the one, the other, or even a third one? And that's where, well, based on my experience, not necessarily only objective decision making plays a role, but internal politics too. Yeah. Where, I mean, and that's where we come in quite often to really, from an outside-in objective perspective, compare the one with the other. First of all, gather the functional and technical requirement of the newly combined entity, challenge everything which is typically referred to as historically grown. So, I mean, if you ask someone, why are you doing that process so complicated? The answer is, yeah, it's historically grown. That's always not a good answer, but it is quite frequently. So what we typically try to do is really start with a fit to standard approach. We come with a more or less 80% system standard or process standard and try to bring that into the game and use that as a starting point. Yeah. But that's, of course, that's a lot more exciting, also then in terms of change management, once decided how to implement. And in the third scenario, if you're carving out certain parts, it depends, and I think we get to that later, but it depends then on the buyer scenario. But typically that to be carved out entity needs a new system. Yeah, so it's then really kind of a greenfield approach, starting from scratch. Yeah, and then you typically select a new system based on company's requirements.
So sticking with the scenario where I'm the treasurer of a company that's acquiring another smaller entity, I'll ask you the same question again. This is going to be my favorite question to you every time, Harald. What's the one thing that treasurers get wrong when they go and to acquire? Is it, my guess, and tell me if I'm wrong or not, is that they go and they say, yeah, of course they're just going to come onto my system, just plug them in over there in the back and it's plug and play.
Yeah, it's I would say it's overestimating synergies and underestimating integration costs and time, which is basically what you said. Yeah. um,
But said much better.
but
Much better.
but it's
You can tell who's the professional
yeah,
consultant here.
but it's
So sure.
but I mean it's true. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's in very rare cases plug and play. Yeah. It is a lot of change management, and that is also related to it. So it's not ignoring, but underestimating cultural integration. Yeah, I mean, you can always plug or roll out your system, but if the people are resistant to change and don't understand why, it's never gonna happen. That goes then also with the importance of communication across the project, and that all kind of leads to, as you correctly said, the integration cost and timeline is to 70% of projects underestimated, and therefore synergies overestimated, which then, yeah, it's not always a good situation to deal in if you need to kind of realize synergies quite fast down the road. Yeah.
I mean, so going back to what you said about payments, and we'll get to the carve-outs and whatnot scenarios later, but again, sticking to if I'm a treasurer acquiring a company, right? Being able to pay for that new company. I mean, I guess it was working as a standalone entity, so you have a bit of the transition. Shouldn't fall apart in the transition, ideally, unless some other business dynamics get affected due to the acquisition. But I mean, it was making its own payments before. It was paying its rent, it was paying its bills, it was paying its staff and whatnot. In theory, it could probably sustain itself until all of that gets mixed into your pot under one payroll eventually, I guess, right? Like, is that, because I'm just touching on it because you mentioned it earlier. Is that ever a consideration in an acquiring
No,
situation?
that's right. That's typically in an acquiring situation should not screw up. I mean, as you said, it's been working in the old. I mean, yes, during transition there might be issues, but it's typically not a big issue. That's really the carve-out situation. I mean, the risk you're having in acquisition scenarios is that, I don't know, from the to be acquired company, you have like a 6-people treasury team, and because of the acquisition, your 3-4 key players leave the company. Especially in countries where your notice period is not 3 or 6 months, but 2 weeks, that can really cause issues and trouble. And I had that in the past quite often, that especially if US companies are acquired, people simply very quickly leave, and then suddenly you have, and they might not have a proper system, so you're losing all transparency, you have no idea about risks, which, I mean, it will not jeopardize the deal, nor will it jeopardize the existence of the company. But until you have that back in order in terms of proper risk, understand FX results and the like, is quite a lot of more time than one would think. So also that talent retention, communication, depending on cultural aspects, is quite key. It sounds quite soft factor, and it is, but it can become a hard factor quite fast if it's not done sufficiently. Yeah.
I mean, a company is just a group of people that are working on something together, right? And if the people fall apart, then the company falls apart, more or less. But I mean, because we didn't discuss going into this, but I'm interested. How do you keep the people around? Is there any way you can? I mean, if someone decides to leave, they decide to leave, right? But at the end of the day, if all the risks are indeed in their head, they knew what was going on. It wasn't in a proper system, in a proper TMS, all there, ready to go to the next person. It was really, you had a couple all-stars, which a lot of companies follow the 80-20 principle, right? 20% of people do 80% of the work. So like, if those 20% of the people leave, and if your treasury department's 5 people, and that's one of them, right?
They're not too good.
then it's not a great scenario. So is that when you go into an M&A scenario, like, do you ever come in and go like, who are your key players as an acquirer, right? The acquirer hired you to make this smooth. You go to the company being acquired, you say, who's your key person? How do we bump him a fat paycheck that keeps him around or anything like this?
Well, you're joking, but I mean, to a certain extent, that is
a conversation that happens.
Well, that's not necessarily fully true, but
The tone.
I mean, yes, I mean, we typically work with our, we have an HR consultancy team that goes into that area, but indeed there is an analysis being done on key players, yeah, from an outside-in perspective, but secondly, talking to senior management of the to-be acquired company. And then indeed there is, in terms of variable payments, there is of course a linkage saying if you stay closing plus 2 years, whatever it is, yeah, there's a certain extra bonus payment related to that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, money is not everything. That doesn't necessarily mean that all people are staying, but of course it incentivizes people staying. I mean, that's from a monetary perspective, but of course, in terms of communication, you can also build a joint vision of a newly built corporate out of 1 and 2, which needs a bigger treasury team, which needs specialized treasury operations in certain regions, and come up, let's say, with job opportunities without maybe clearly allocating them, but just making up a growing vision, and not necessarily which most people have in their heads is synergies, is cost cutting, is laying off people. But from my experience in treasury, that is not so frequently the case, because the teams are not that big. Yeah, I mean, if you have 800 people working in accounting, that's a different story. But if it's 6 or 7 in treasury, the cost savings are relatively small in absolute euro terms.
Does it ever go up? So have you ever seen a situation in an acquisition where the acquiring company has, let's say, 5 treasurers, the to-be acquired company has 2 treasurers, but in the end you end up with 10 because you realize that, okay, it's just the new complexity just requires more roles? Or does it always stay flat or go down? Maybe a stupid question.
No, I mean, I would say staying flat or going down is the normal case, where it's slightly going down. In that small example you did, it's probably stable is the right answer. But if you're talking 30 plus 20, then it's probably going down a bit. But I've seen cases, and that's especially if you were just saying if it's like 10 people and 2, where the to-be acquired company was simply operating totally different. Yeah, they were not doing liquidity planning. They had no in-house bank. They had no payment factory and what have you. And when they now apply all the new processes, they just need more people. Yeah, so that can be the case, but it's in rare cases. Yeah,
probably in a scenario where indeed the to-be acquired company's treasury just wasn't that good to start with, or indeed there was a lot of opportunities for savings which they weren't taking, and then when they get acquired, they said, okay, actually you've got 2 treasurers, but maybe we need 4 because we want to start doing FX hedging better. We want to start doing better cash flow forecasting to mitigate our debt better, improve our working capital, etc. Right? So that may be the scenario where that happens. Very interesting. So I'll come to one that's arguably a little bit more interesting: spin-offs. Right? So if I'm a treasurer, that is, and my company has decided to spin off a department to become its own little entity, do I just forget about it and let it fend for itself, or how does that get managed?
Well, unfortunately, typically the CFO tells you that you're in charge of building something up, so it's difficult to get out of responsibility there. But yes, I mean, it depends a bit on the materiality of the business to be sold. But typically, indeed, the treasurer is in charge to build something up for the to be sold part. I mean, also there, typically you get either someone of the team steps up and says he wants to be treasurer of the new part, or someone externally with experience is hired to build it up. And then, I mean, the interesting situation is, at least in I would say 90% of the cases, the board decides to spin off certain business with, of course, the uncertainty of the buyer scenario. So, or the exit scenario, if you like. So is it a financial investor, private equity, venture capital? Is it a strategic investor, so competition, or someone complementing its portfolio? Or is it even an IPO? All possible. But of course, it then also depends on what you need from a treasury perspective. So if the target scenario is private equity or financial investor, you typically need a full end-to-end treasury because you're operating independently, you just have a financial investor. On the other hand, if a strategic investor acquires you, let's say competition, then it's 80-90% the case that your treasury will be integrated. So you don't need your treasury anymore. And then IPO, similar to a financial investor, you need to have your full treasury operations. So what we typically recommend is, no matter where you're going, start with building up the basics. A basic treasury, small team with consultants, temporarily hire, managed services, that you don't build up permanent staff to a big extent. At an early stage, do the basics on payments and so on. And then once it's decided which route to go, you can still, let's say, do the remaining left and right pieces where the strategic investor you would probably stop building up. For a financial investor, you would then put in a lot of manpower to get the last steps done to be really fully operational and independent. So that really depends. But in any case, the treasurer of let's say the mother company is always in charge, and then typically strongly advising the new entity, at least until signing, to help have that established, because of course, after all, it's also in his goal achievement from a CFO perspective to have a successful spin-off.
What are those basics of treasury, Harald, that you would say that a spin-off company should always be born with, let's say? What would you say is the bare minimum that every spin-off needs to have established?
Again, and here what we discussed earlier is really payment readiness, but that really in a basic way. So having your bank account, having your electronic banking, and being able to process payments. We're not talking about a centralized payment factory or an in-house bank or something like that, but just being ready to pay. Having the funding in place in regulated countries as well as centrally, and that of course goes very closely to the buyout scenario, on how you approach that, and being able to at least hedge on a central level the core risks on typically FX. I would say those are the must-haves, and for that you need to have a very basic system or a set, and there's a tendency towards that to have a service partner that offers managed services, operates services that can help you bridge that time. So for example, we're also supporting clients in bringing people in, bringing a system in to help him for the first quarter or two, until he has stabilized and has hired sufficient people to get it up and running. But it's, I think, again, around payment readiness, financing readiness, and hedging readiness that are the must-haves to have in place.
And so, to follow up on that, have you seen scenarios where, do not want to sing praise of treasury too much, but have you seen scenarios where strategic investors or PE firms are like, guys, you should, this operation is happening only in the treasury department, it's at this stage upon acquiring, or like saying, guys, your payment landscape is just not up to speed or up to the standards? Like, is it a consideration even when it comes to the negotiations and all the due diligences that are done, treasury considerations?
Well, there are, but right in terms of transparency, funding structure, guarantees, how many, performance bonds and what have you, you have outstanding in terms of contingent liabilities. So it's more how you structure and manage it. It's less on whether you have, 20 banking partners or 30. Yes, that implies cost savings, but from an overall deal perspective, it's too nitty-gritty.
And so, to borrow Husam's favorite question, although I feel you've already answered to it a bit with the basics of treasury that needs to be up to speed, what are the key priorities? What are the no-miss that treasurer should focus on in a carve-out process?
Yeah, if we really look from the perspective of the guy that needs to build up the treasury, I would really try to get helping hands from wherever you can, internally, externally, from the former treasury team, and then really focus on those core priorities. Because just the contracting on banks, on KYC, on FX lines, on ISTA agreements, on guarantee lines, that itself is filling days and nights and weeks of work without thinking about an efficient process. So I would really get all hands operational on the ground and start working and really then focus on optimizing things later on, because it will just not happen.
Makes sense. Who usually takes that role? Is it somebody from the previous treasury team who gets a kind of promotion, say, okay, now you're group treasurer of this carve-out? Or is it better to get somebody from the outside world to come and take that function, who will be specialized into treasury transformation or treasury revamping, or even treasury, not transformation, but setup, because everything has to be done? How does it typically work?
I would say twofold. I mean, for the very big corporations that spin off parts, typically someone internally takes up that role. You then typically have quite big treasury teams of 50 plus people. And that offers, of course, quite a nice career opportunity as you're, let's say, moving out of a certain department where you're a bit more of a niche player into a really broad role of corporate treasury. Whereas if your treasury team is only 10 people or 15 people, typically it's rather someone is hired externally, also because the treasurer does not necessarily want to free up someone because he's scarce on resources anyhow. And there we see quite hiring of external candidates, and also they're twofold. I mean, there's a market of quite experienced treasurers that have done that in the past, which are always kind of willing to move and take on the next challenge of IPO or what have you, or it's even to bridge the resource gap, because you typically do not have time to look for someone for 6, 9, 12 months, then the deal is half over. So you also look into the interim market or the consultancy market, that you find a small team or people that can take over and start the activities already.
Right. What are the typical skills that are required? Because I'm thinking, do you want an absolute machine in cash and liquidity management and FX hedging management? Or do you want somebody who has change management background, who knows how to transform stuff, who knows how to lead team to build something from scratch? I guess both of worlds, but best of both worlds, sorry. But so what are you looking for in somebody who will take on that role in a carve-out?
I mean, as you said, ideally best of both worlds, but that's typically then the difficulty where you don't find the people at short notice. I think the super deep technical skills, I don't know, on payment formats and what have you, is not priority one. I would really say priority one is a good orchestrator, treasury generalist, and manager who can really steer change, manage change, do quick decisions, and be really take ownership of the whole process. That's more important to have that profile rather than all the nitty-gritty details which you can somewhat hire or buy at the market, that expertise, but someone who also then knows how to manage the other stakeholders, like your CFO, your head of accounting, your head of IT, the banks, system providers, lawyers, M&A boutiques. That's quite a big environment you're acting in. So it's better to have those management orchestration skills than the technical details of treasury.
Okay, Harald, bring us to I think probably the hardest of the various scenarios, which is if I'm a company being acquired and I'm the treasurer of a company being acquired. What are my key responsibilities there? I'm guessing a lot of internal politics come into play here, but trying to keep that, we'll get to that. Let's start maybe with the objective roles. and then what you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is indeed, I think history has shown, or if you would do like a statistical view on how those deals ended up in the past, that typically once you're acquired and it's a central function like Treasury is, and it's typically quite centralized. Yeah, you're working in the integration, but your team and your department at a certain point in time ceases to exist. I mean, that's just fact and reality. Yeah. Which does not mean that for the individual there's not room for career or further development. Yeah, definitely not the case. But it really means that typically you need to position yourself indeed quite well and openly, be proactive, and yes, sell yourself, if you like. Yeah, sell yourself to the new group treasurer, to the CFO, in playing an important role, because I mean, typically where also integrations fail is not having the right managers of the acquired company, because they're leaving, they're laid off, and then you have no one really managing the integration itself. Yeah, that's where we see a lot of integrations failing. So those people are key, and not, or we see that quite often, that they get quite interesting roles in the new organization. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be treasury, it can be broader finance, can be regional treasury head, or what have you. So quite a diverse picture, but of course, as a matter of fact, the importance of having your own department reporting to the CFO, yeah, it's just a matter of time until this will not be in place anymore, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're no longer the group treasurer in that scenario, I guess, or the treasury lead in whatever role you were. But I mean, so some treasurers, I guess, in that scenario will have the intrinsic, let's say, motivation and the love for what they've built or their team or whatever, to make sure that transition happens as smoothly as possible, right? So from a treasury perspective, how do you manage that? And as someone that does want to stick around and does want to do, or is incentivized to for whatever reason, right? They're told, hey, if you manage a transition, you get this role, which is still a very good one in a bigger company, et cetera, et cetera. How does that? What are the actual technicalities of being acquired as a treasury department?
Yeah, I think it's a lot on proactivity. So explaining the acquiring company, your setup, your treasury, being transparent on financials in terms of cash, liquidity, risks, how you're handling certain activities, what's your setup, what's maybe also innovation things you've done in the past. If you worked on, I don't know, AI forecasting, have you implemented a small RPA? Have you done an API to a bank recently? You know, all the technology buzzwords currently flying around, where maybe you're even more advanced than the acquiring company. Yeah, where you can maybe move into, I don't know, being the innovation officer of treasury. So really being proactive is I would say key. Unfortunately, I mean, the steering wheel is not in your hands anymore. Yeah, so you can try to be active and get into the discussion as early as possible. But after all, of course, you're depending on the acquiring part of how they play the game.
Harald, we want to get into the nitty-gritty of M&A, treasury transformation, technology, banking structure. Before that, one last question we have for you. What's your main recommendation? What are the no misses for treasurers undergoing an acquisition from another company? What is the critical success criteria here?
But position yourself as a value-adding partner. Yeah, play an active role in value creation, in synergy creation. Play an active role in people retention of your own team to make the overall deal a success, without having the certainty of your personal future in terms of career. Yeah, probably not an easy one, not necessarily. But on the other hand, I think the people I know that have been in such a situation, they learn so much during that time, they grow that much, they get so much experience that they typically position themselves very well for additional careers outside the company.
I like that a lot. Harald, take us through the treasury technology and banking structure impacts when it comes to M&A. So to begin with, maybe how does M&A activities impact the treasury's technology infrastructure? And typically here, what system do you look at? What do you overlook? What should be kept? What should be replaced? I think you mentioned earlier, maybe it's a third-party system that you want to implement because none of them are good. How does it all work here?
Yeah. No, indeed. And I mean, that's an important area also in terms of synergies generation typically. Also, this is quite an important part of the business case to kind of shut down one of the systems, only have one in place, which of course saves quite some money in terms of licensing and administration. So at that, let's say in an acquiring scenario where a really big one acquires a smaller one, then it's typically a no-brainer, and they're simply integrated. It indeed gets more important when they're similar in size, or even if it's a merger. Then what we typically do is indeed we start from a really objective requirements analysis. And I'd say what are really your functional requirements, IT requirements now and in the near future? How are the, let's say, company specifics required or not? Can we move a bit more into industry standard? And then we perform an objective comparison between the two systems and come up with a recommendation for the one or the other. And typically, when a third system comes into discussion, is mainly for political reasons. Those decisions are rarely done only objectively, to be honest. There's always the one has the favor for the one system, the other one for the other system. And then sometimes to not losing one of the parties, losing their face, you come up with a third potential system, which is also typically functionality-wise good and maybe easier to say, look, we go a fully different direction. We really use this change from an M&A perspective as a transition towards a modern future-proof treasury setup. So we're transforming both parties into something new. So we see indeed both quite often. Yeah. Although the cost typically being a bit higher if you move to a third-party system, which was not used by one of the two parties in the past. But in terms of acceptance, it's sometimes easier than the other way around. In a carve-out scenario, of course, and that's always, I think, why those projects are quite exciting. You basically start on a greenfield approach in many cases. So you can really define your requirements and start a system selection from scratch, and basically select the system you're looking for. At least, let's say, if you have sufficient time. If there's limited time, and that's what we've also seen here and there, there's not sufficient time to select and implement a new system, then you typically get a copy of the old system. You get rid of all the data that you're not allowed to see, and the functionality, you have a running system, which is typically overscaled and too complex for what you really need, and also too cost intense. So typically then after change of control, this is being replaced with something right fitting and suiting the treasury operations of the newly established entity.
Are those those budget and cost considerations, are they discussed before the merger or acquisition or carve-out happens for the treasury specifically? Because revamping a whole treasury department, if you go for that route, and like you say, okay, guys, it's the perfect opportunity to see where we are right now, see where we want to be, and make sure that we, as of now, start implement a best-in-class type of treasury department. The cost discussion linked to this, are they happening during the M&A discussion itself, or once it's decided and it's time for the assessment and we're like, oh, okay, actually we are a bit behind what's happening in the industry? When do you decide? Because I'm obviously thinking, maybe a bit biased, but I'm obviously thinking about consulting costs here. When you come into action and say, okay, we need help to do that. That's what happens in a lot of cases. Are these budgets typically discussed prior to it, whilst it's happening, or how does it go?
Well, they are considered prior, but of course on a very high level. So typically what is being done is that the M&A and the whole business case team that is basically calculating the case, whether it's worth acquiring or not, they plan for integration costs. And part of that is all kind of, internal and external costs, whether it's consultancy, whether it's IT service providers, what have you. And there are also a certain piece for treasury is considered. Yes. So, but it's not to the extent that, okay, we want to do, I don't know, landscape optimization, we do bank optimization, so we need budget X, Y, Z. It's more like a top-down approach of how to allocate budgets then afterwards. Yeah.
Nice. So, Harald, one thing we didn't talk about in all this, which is an incredibly important part of treasury, is banking relationships and how you manage your relationship with your banks. So in each of the scenarios, so if we run through acquiring a company, I think that's probably straightforward, right? You just kind of tell your bank. If you're going to synergize on banks, you tell them, hey, look, I need these extra accounts, whatnot, to these jurisdictions. But if I'm being acquired, or if setting off a spin-off, that's more business for the bank. That's pretty straightforward. If I'm being acquired then, or in a merger situation where it's a bit more equal, how does those relationships with banks usually go? Do the banks try and peg their horse as quick as they can and then try to sneak in there, or how do you guys manage the banks?
They always want to be part, of course, on the whole M&A deal, but more, let's say, from an advisory, structuring, funding perspective. But that is typically decided at a quite early point in time. Yeah. But in terms of bank landscape, bank relations, it is very important from various perspectives. So first, if we talk about, let's say, credit or lines for funding, guarantees, and FX. Typically, if you're a big company, you're acquiring another one, you just add new bank relations, add new lines, and then you can basically sort it out afterwards. You typically focus or define like a core banking group of 10 to 20 banks where you do most of your business with, and then you try to harmonize the bank landscape. But there's no super urgency in doing so, typically after the acquisition, because you still have it. Different in a spin-off scenario, especially if you spin off like sizes of, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 billion revenue business, then you sometimes have the case where big global banks tell you, look, segment is not really part of my business. We'll still support you, but after change of control, you should look for new banking partners. Yeah, so that changes the dimension quite a bit, where you really need to be careful in looking who will be your long-term banking partner, also in terms of financing FX lines down the road. What you typically have then in acquisitions is you acquire a huge, typically heterogeneous banking landscape in terms of bank accounts and payments. And that is quite a big business case to harmonize that globally, where we typically do also banking RFPs structured per region most of the time, and where you can save quite a lot in terms of banking fees, but then of course overall reduction of bank accounts if you think about in-house bank and payment factory structures. That's quite a timely process, taking 12 to 24 months to have that all harmonized, but that typically from a return on invest perspective pays off quite fast. That's quite important. But as always for treasury, the banks are one very important factor of the most important partner for corporate treasury, most likely. So whenever you're approaching M&A activities, I think it's important to start early discussions with the banks on your situation. Of course, you typically then have selected your core M&A banks and how certain things are being treated. If you're selling business, is that still supported? What do you do with your financing? So really using that as a trustful partnership relationship, I think is key to manage your bank relations. Although, At a certain point in time, you might need to also lay off the one or the other bank, because the portfolio is just so big. On the other hand, that's what the banks do as well. The company gets too small, so I think it's just somewhat normal course of the business.
We didn't talk about this before. How does your credit rating change when you go through merger or acquisition? Like, I mean, do the ratings of both parties become invalid, and you need to get a new one as a merged entity? In either scenario, I guess if you're acquiring something small, you can just kind of have a discussion with your ratings agency and it's no problem. But in a merger situation or anything like that, is it from scratch? Do previous ratings make the new ones? Do the rating agencies take that into account? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, in smaller acquisitions, it's typically not playing a role. But of course, we had also really big acquisitions in the back, which are typically mainly debt funded. Yeah, so where your leverage ratio increases quite a bit. It's still looked at it. Let's say if the acquisition company buys another one, then typically the rating process follows not at super short notice, but afterwards. And you're of course also there in frequent discussions with your rating agencies. But I mean, we've seen in the past here and there that after a big acquisition, that rating notches have been downgraded slightly. Yeah, giving the huge leverage. So that's definitely a case. For others, I mean, also we see if you spin off big parts, which are not small, but like also exchange listed, that you also need to look for a new rating, right? Because that part of the entity has never had a rating before. So you need to start approaching rating agencies. You need to build up knowledge and experience. I mean, there's certain triggers and KPIs, right? That steer which rating class you'll be integrated into. So that's also an important aspect if you look at the spin-off side of things. Yeah, but it's not that, let's say, rating A or entity A has just making up a triple A and the other one has a single B, then the average is double B. That's not how it happens. It's typically the combined entities also do not necessarily share the same balance sheet structure. There's typically a lot of, in such big mergers, a lot of changes to the balance sheet happening in terms of leverage. So typically it's been reassessed after the closing has been taking place.
Awesome. Harald, obviously you know a lot about mergers and acquisitions, especially when it comes to treasury transformations. So can you walk us through a little bit how Deloitte assists in treasury transformation during typically all the activities we just mentioned, merger and acquisitions, carve-outs, spin-offs, and whatnot?
Sure, I mean, happy to do so. And I mean, as we were discussing in the last hours, I mean, there's a lot of activities going on, and we typically also help along the life cycle. So we start with due diligence support, we do clean team activities, and then it kind of splits up depending on the buyer scenario or the M&A scenario. A lot of times we do indeed support building up treasury organizations and carve-outs from scratch, where we support manpower-wise, knowledge-wise, tool-wise to build it up, but mostly also to stabilize after signing and closing. We prepare the integration and support the clients in integration with our know-how, not only on treasury, but as we touched upon earlier, that's the HR-related aspects like change management and the like. But what we're also doing, we're optimizing treasury organizations that more from a financial investor perspective during the holding period of a private equity, and then also support on the exit preparation along the road. Yeah. And what we typically bring, I mean, as said early, a lot of work, limited time, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of requests. Of course, to kind of facilitate that over the last years, and also with our global team, we have developed quite a lot of accelerators and tools where we have like a transformation toolbox where we have templates on guidelines, on processes, on contracts, on best practice system implementations and the like, just to kind of speed up the process, giving that, I mean, depending, I think the fastest we did was we started the project and 3 months later there was change of control. That was crazy, not to be done anymore. I hope that was limited sleep. But then on the other hand, there's of course longer periods, but it's always quite tight timeline to be looked at. Yeah.
How does it work? Do you have a client undergoing an acquisition, merger or whatnot, and saying, "Hey, Harald, this is the deadline," and like you have to work towards it? Or is it a discussion saying, "Look, we need to go through this. What's the best way to approach it, and how fast can you execute on this?" Because as you said, it will typically depend on resources, but also budget. Yeah, we can put 50 analysts on the case, and it's done in 3 months. Or 25 not sleeping a lot. Or we can say, look, this is what we have right now. This is the goal that is realistic, and this is what we can work towards. What's the right balance here, and how do the typical projects come in?
Unfortunately, 90% come in with a fixed timeline, which is not defined by Treasury, which is defined by the overall M&A track. So there's limited room for negotiation or none. It also, I mean, it's also the case that, let's say, in 50% of the deals, deadlines are being postponed. Yeah, that's also a matter of fact. But that is, in very rare cases, Treasury driven. Yeah, this is decided on a different level, and you mostly need to adhere to those timelines. I mean, if at a certain point in time in a carve-out scenario, Treasury would raise the hand and say, "Hey, we cannot achieve payment readiness," then that would potentially lead to a shift in go live, but that's of course to be avoided at any cost. Yeah.
That makes sense. Can you share a success stories maybe, Harald, of where Deloitte played a pivotal role in transforming a treasury department as a result of an M&A activity?
Yeah, yes, of course. I mean, I think 2020, a big energy company had the IPO, and that was indeed the situation. Was quite a big part of the entity that was basically separated and spun off, also with quite a tight timeline that was also announced at the Investors Day. So it had to be worked towards that. They started basically with 2 people in Treasury and had a good year to go live. So we kind of came in indeed as a bigger team across all topics, and we started on defining what's our operating model, where do we need which people. System was important at the beginning because it was clear that the system of the remaining mother could not be copy-pasted. So you had to build something up in a complex environment. So we started the system selection in a very quick way and then worked towards that. But payment readiness was also their key, and then the full orchestration, where you sometimes really think contract is simple, but it's not. Ensuring that all the contracting is properly done and signed across the globe in time is always quite a challenge. But we did manage then to go live with a significant, or the IPO with a significant piece. And as always, we did then optimizations afterwards. Yeah, so there were still remaining optimizations, for example, on reporting. Typically something you do afterwards, have your nice BI reportings established, things like that. Yeah. Similar for an automotive supplier, also 2 years ago, it was like a 7-8 billion part that was being spun off. Also their tight timeline where we supported basically end to end from scratch. And there, quite interestingly, and there we indeed see a bit of a trend that either transactional activities or more complex activities there's a tendency to outsource them, not only at a short period of time, but longer term, like the hedge documentation, effectiveness calculation, coming up with the postings. Smaller companies don't have the capacity to build up that knowledge. So that is being outsourced, or the business administration of the system, setting up new users, keeping user rights up to date. similar thing where we see more tendencies towards. That's quite interesting to see. Yeah.
I guess you guys see all of the potential post-merger and acquisition opportunities because you're part of the actual merger and acquisition, right? So when you guys come in, it's not just you come in, do the acquisition deal and leave. You come in, do the deal, and then drive savings for the client, I guess, in that way, right? That makes a lot of sense because you've seen it all. So
yeah, especially on the integration side. I mean, really realizing those synergies. It's always easy to have them on paper and glossy PowerPoint, but realizing them and making them measurable is it's a different page to be tackled. Yeah, totally agreed.
100%. Do you see any evolving trends in the overall treasury space for mergers and acquisitions? Anything that you guys are working on, Deloitte? Anything that you see that in the future is going to be really, really interesting, or in how deals are being structured, in how debt is working, in any of these aspects?
I would say nothing too fancy or new on that side, to be honest. That's still quite. I mean, we discussed about things like FX contingent forwards and the like, but they've been in place for quite a while. I think it's more on speed, so you need to be faster, even on those transactions. So you need to come up with tools to really be able to have, let's say, standalone readiness quicker and faster. But in M&A, I would not see so many things. I mean, what we see in terms of data, AI, RPAs, and so on, having those huge models on calculating the business case, the entity and equity value of the corporate. I mean, there we see models evolving rapidly. For treasury can be applied to cash forecasting, AI aspects. There we see a lot of changes already happening now, which is not strictly close to treasury M&A, but in a broader, let's say, treasury environment, I would say.
Super clear. Harold, thank you so much for coming on the show. There was a real masterclass, and I think a lot of treasurers took away a lot on, if they are ever in that scenario, what are they meant to be thinking about? So I think that's going to be super valuable. Is there anything about the topics that we've touched upon that maybe you didn't get a chance to say that you want to add, or a nuance you want to bring in that perhaps wasn't covered?
No, I think from my perspective, I think we covered a lot. I mean, as you rightly said, it's a huge area. I mean, I can only always say, I mean, M&A implies big changes. Try to take them as a chance for change, for transition, to build your future-proof treasury. I mean, it's rare cases where you have the chance to really, not think from scratch, but restructure quite a lot of activities. So try to use the time to do so. That's, I think, one of the key takeaways I have taken over the last 15 years.
Super interesting. And if people want to know more about you, Deloitte, the services that you offer for treasury, not just M&A, but generally, where should they go?
Well, you can find me, of course, on all the social media like LinkedIn or Xing. I think we can also drop the link to our website in the show notes for everyone who's being interested. So very much looking forward to discuss all those aspects on treasury M&A and being kind of passionate on treasury.
100%. Harold, appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.